So if you haven't been here the last couple of weeks, we very intentionally switched from our opening series, which was very timely, to talk about addiction and recovery, to, in the season of Lent, looking at something that's quite a bit more timeless, and that's to study and get deep into the Gospel of Luke. Really, in this Lenten season, to get to know Jesus more deeply by reading and studying and learning the Gospel of Luke, and particularly seeing a unique perspective that each of the Gospel writers, but this series, that Luke has on Jesus. And so what I've been doing the weeks in Lent is looking at the text that we've read from the previous week and just teaching a little bit on that and helping us to see them a little bit more clearly. So the readings from this past week are from the Gospel of Luke in chapter 6. So we're starting in verse 17. I think that was the reading maybe for last Sunday. So one of the things I highlighted already in Luke, and that you should kind of look out for in Luke, is Luke likes to batch stories. We hear that he had all these eyewitness accounts of things that Jesus did. He likes to arrange them in a batch of material, which helps us to understand that material more deeply by pairing similar stories. So chapter 6, verse 17 really starts out with a bunch of teaching. There's a number of different stories, and it's a little confusing. We're not quite sure. It starts out with the crowds, but then Jesus particularly highlights the disciples. We don't know if he was just looking especially and focusing on the disciples in the crowd, or whether in fact he steps aside and only teaches just the disciples, but clearly he has some teaching for us. One of the things to look for in this section, and you may have noticed this, is again a focus on the outsider, the needy, those who have concerns. It's a big theme in the Gospel of Luke, and so Jesus teaches on this as well. And a second theme in this teaching is that Jesus really encourages the disciples. In Luke's day, as one of the later Gospels, he already knew that the disciples would have hard times, and Jesus had prepared them for this, wants them to endure and continue with the ministry that they are called to, even though things will be difficult for them. One thing I would note about really any stretch of teaching in the Bible, but at this section in particular, is it might be helpful to read it more slowly, a little bit deliberately, because it's this teaching, this teaching, this teaching. If you just read it, all in one shot, you might not get quite as much of the value of it. So it might help to just slowly read, then pause a little bit, reflect on a particular piece of teaching. If you have the ability, maybe, go about some things you got to get done around the house, think about it, then come back and read a little bit more and be a little bit more deliberate, because there's a whole bunch of teaching that Luke does batch in this particular section. So that section then continues through the end of chapter 6. And as chapter 7 begins, we hear a whole batch of stories that highlight people's reaction to Jesus. And this is, again, a theme in Luke. We can find this in all the Gospels, but especially in Luke, that makes us ask, how will we respond to Jesus? How will Jesus be a part of our lives? How will we follow Jesus? The first of those stories is one in which that we heard earlier from Jesus interacting with a centurion. Now understand, as a centurion, he is not just an outsider like a tax collector or a sinful woman we'll hear about in a moment, but he is the enemy. He is a representative of the Roman Empire. But he comes to Jesus for a healing. And Jesus is impressed by the faith he sees. The centurion's reaction is positive, is faithful indeed. So two things that are kind of clever in Luke's writing of this story is around the idea of worth. The religious leaders come to Jesus and say that this man is worthy. He's been good to us. He's even built our synagogue. But the centurion sends word that he is not worthy even to have Jesus come and visit his house. And then around the theme of authority, the centurion, says, I am one who is under authority, and I have authority over slaves and soldiers who do what I want. But he says, I know that you, Jesus, have the authority. You don't even have to come to my house. Just say the word, and I know that you have the authority to have this healing take place. And again, Jesus is amazed at the faith he sees in this not only Jewish man, but a centurion, an enemy. Again, that calls us to say, how will we respond to Jesus? And then we hear another story, this one about a healing, really a bringing back to life of a young man in Nain. And the people of the crowds, we hear in their response something that calls us to wonder. It says, fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, a prophet has arisen among us, and God has looked favorably on his people. Will we be like the people in Nain and respond the same to Jesus? And then the next story that makes us wonder how we respond to Jesus is about John the Baptist and his disciples. He wants to know if Jesus is the one. And what we find out in this story is that what John had expected, Jesus exceeds. And John is impressed, and the disciples are touched as well. And at the end of that story, we hear again this question of how we will respond and how they responded to Jesus. We hear in verse 29 that even tax collectors came to believe, lowest end of the social status there, they worked for the enemy, that they come to believe in Jesus. But the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected God's purpose for themselves. They do not believe in Jesus. That contrast again, will we be like the lowly tax collectors, or will we be like the religious leaders, the Pharisees? Those stories of how we respond to Jesus continue. In the chapter 7, verse 36, we hear of yet another story, the one that I just read, in terms of a Pharisee who has Jesus as a guest but doesn't understand who Jesus is, and of a sinful woman, we're not told what it is, but of a sinful woman who comes and washes his feet with her tears and dries them with her hair. Again, the contrast between the Pharisee and the sinful woman. And which will we be? Will we fall at Jesus' feet like she did? Then, and at the very end of that story, Jesus links faith and salvation. The final verse in that chapter, he says, and he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Luke often links our faith and salvation. And he does that again later in another story yet in this section. As the 8th chapter starts, we're back to more teaching, a batch of teaching. But before he goes on into that, Luke does something that is unusual in the ancient world. He lifts up the role of women. He names by name a number of women who follow Jesus, and even says that they provided for them, Jesus and the disciples, out of their resources. They're not only disciples and following Jesus, but they're actually supporting and encouraging his ministry. Luke often lifts up the role of women. And then it's on into a batch of teaching, the parable of the sower, and the explanation of the same, and some more teaching. When we get to verse 19, we see a story recorded also in Matthew and Matthew and Mark, where Jesus' family, his mother and brothers, come to Jesus. And in the other gospel stories, we get the sense that Jesus somewhat rejects them in favor of his disciples. Luke does not present it that way. He simply says, those are my disciples, or those are my family who follow Jesus. And this is, again, because we believe that Luke actually interviewed Mary and wouldn't have wanted to present such a disrespectful son to his mother, that it was that close relationship Luke had with her. And then starting in verse 22, we enter another batch, this time stories about how Jesus displays his power. His power. The first of those is the calming of the storm, and we see his power in that story. Then when he gets to the other side of the lake, he heals a man who had been possessed by demons. The demons are called legion, and legions were up to 6,000 soldiers. So this man is quite tormented. And we see that Jesus bests the demons and sends them off into the pigs to destroy themselves. As his power continues, we see a story, or actually two, that we saw dramatized earlier. It's one that he received directly from Mark. If you remember 2 years ago when we studied the Gospel of Mark, one of the things that I shared was that Mark likes to put one story inside of another, and Luke, receiving that, continues that same pattern. So we hear the beginning of Jairus, who needs a healing for his wife, or for his daughter who has died. Then on the way, Jesus heals a woman that has a bleeding disorder. One of the things that I find, it's just those little quirks that I find interesting about each of the Gospels. Mark and Matthew record that this woman had this bleeding disorder and had seen many doctors, and they record it as she endured much under these other doctors and wasn't healed. We know that Luke was a physician, and so as a physician, he seems to kind of look out for his fellow doctors, so he omits endured much, just kind of downplaying that which Mark and I just find those little things kind of interesting, and just says she had gone to many doctors and was not healed. Of course, she receives that healing, and then the story goes back to the little girl that, again, we saw portrayed where Jesus heals her. And to Jairus, he says again that reminder is, do not fear, only believe, and she will be saved. Again, Luke links belief and salvation. And then as that section ends, we hear even Herod asking this question, which has been throughout this section. Herod says, John I beheaded, but who is this about whom I hear so much? Again, this is a question not just that Herod poses or the people in Jesus' day, but it's a question that we need to wrestle with as well. Who is this about whom we hear so much? Will we throw ourselves at Jesus' feet like the woman who was a sinner, or Jairus, or any that Jesus encountered? Who do we say Jesus is in our lives?